Hello everyone. Tonight I've prepared a special compilation of trucker stories, all gathered into one soothing episode for you to enjoy. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps support the channel. Now let's begin. The Hiccup Manifest. From Jake Morrison, the CB radio had been crackling with static for the better part of 3 hours as I rolled my Peterbilt through the Nevada desert, hauling what the manifest listed simply as medical specimens, temperature controlled. The dispatcher back in Reno had been unusually vague about the pickup, just handed me the keys and said the trailer was already loaded and sealed. 22 years driving long haul, and I'd learned not to ask too many questions about cargo that paid premium rates for overnight delivery to research facilities. The refrigeration unit hummed steadily behind my cab, maintaining whatever temperature those specimens needed to stay viable during the long haul to a laboratory complex outside Phoenix. The night was unusually still for this stretch of highway, with not even a whisper of wind disturbing the Joshua trees that stood like twisted sentinels in the moonlight. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness ahead, illuminating the endless ribbon of asphalt that stretched toward distant mountains. The engine's steady rumble had always been a comfort on these lonely runs, a mechanical heartbeat that kept me company through the small hours when the rest of the world slept. But tonight something felt different about the rhythm, as if there was an echo coming from somewhere behind me that didn't quite match the cadence of my diesel engine. I'd been making good time despite the late start, keeping the speedometer steady at just above the limit, while the mile markers ticked by in their hypnotic sequence. The trailer behind me tracked straight and true, its weight well distributed and properly secured according to the loading documents. But as the hours passed, I began to notice something odd about the way the refrigeration unit was cycling. Instead of the usual steady hum punctuated by the occasional click of the compressor engaging, there seemed to be an irregular pattern emerging, a stuttering rhythm that reminded me of something I couldn't quite place. At first, I dismissed it as a minor mechanical quirk, perhaps a loose belt or a compressor that needed adjustment. Refrigerated trailers were finicky beasts at the best of times, and the desert heat during the day could stress the cooling systems in ways that didn't show up until the temperature differential increased after sunset. But as I listened more carefully, adjusting my mirrors to catch any visual signs of malfunction, the sound began to take on a more distinct character. It wasn't mechanical at all, I realized with a growing sense of unease. It sounded almost organic, like a breathing pattern that kept getting interrupted. The sensation of being watched crept over me gradually, the way desert cold seeps through truck cab insulation in the hours before dawn. I found myself checking my mirrors more frequently, scanning the empty highway behind me for headlights that weren't there. The feeling was irrational, I knew, but 22 years on the road had taught me to trust my instincts even when logic suggested otherwise. Something about this load felt wrong, though I couldn't articulate exactly what was triggering my unease. The paperwork had been in order, the trailer properly sealed with official tamper-evident locks, and the refrigeration unit was maintaining temperature according to its digital display. It was during a long, gentle curve around a mesa that I first heard what sounded distinctly like a hiccup coming from the trailer behind me. The sound was muffled but audible over the road noise, a sharp intake followed by that characteristic vocal spasm that everyone recognizes. I immediately checked my CB radio, thinking perhaps someone was transmitting on my channel with an open mic, but the display showed no activity. The sound came again a few seconds later, then again, establishing a pattern that was unmistakably biological rather than mechanical. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Medical specimens could mean many things, I told myself. Perhaps laboratory animals or tissue samples that might produce sounds as they shifted or settled during transport. But the hiccuping continued with increasing frequency, and gradually I began to detect what sounded like variations in pitch and timbre, as if multiple sources were contributing to the chorus. The refrigeration unit's hum seemed to amplify these sounds rather than mask them, creating an acoustic environment where every hiccup echoed and reverberated through the trailer's insulated walls. I reached for my cell phone to call the dispatcher, but the screen showed no signal bars in this remote stretch of desert. The nearest truck stop was still 40 miles ahead, and pulling over on the shoulder to investigate would mean breaking the seals on a cargo that clearly carried serious liability. The documentation had been very specific about maintaining the cold chain and avoiding any interruption in transport, with penalty clauses that could cost me months of income if something went wrong. But the hiccuping was becoming more pronounced, more frequent, and undeniably more varied in its patterns and tones. The sound began to take on an almost conversational quality, as if different voices were responding to each other in the only way they could manage. Some hiccups were high and sharp, others deeper and more resonant, creating a strange symphony of involuntary sounds that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of the road. I found myself unconsciously adjusting my speed to see if it would affect the pattern, and to my growing alarm, the hiccuping seemed to respond to changes in the truck's motion, becoming more agitated when I accelerated and more subdued during periods of steady cruising. The road ahead began a long descent toward a valley where scattered lights indicated some form of human habitation, perhaps a small desert community or research station. As my altitude decreased, the air pressure changes seemed to affect whatever was in my trailer, and the hiccuping intensified to the point where it was clearly audible over my engine noise. But now I could make out something else mixed in with the sounds, a quality that made my blood run cold as I recognized it. Between the hiccups, barely audible but unmistakably present, were what sounded like attempts at human speech. The words were fragmented and distorted, broken up by the involuntary spasms, but they carried an emotional weight that spoke of consciousness and distress. "Help!" came through clearly several times, followed by what might have been names or pleas that dissolved into more hiccuping before they could be fully understood. The voices were definitely human, multiple individuals of different ages and genders, all struggling to communicate through the strange affliction that had reduced their speech to interrupted fragments. I began to understand with horrifying clarity that my cargo was not medical specimens at all, but people, living human beings who had been reduced to this hiccuping condition and were being transported like laboratory subjects. The refrigeration wasn't to preserve tissue samples, but to maintain some form of stasis or control over individuals who had been subjected to something that affected their ability to communicate normally. The premium rate for this run, the secrecy around the loading, the remote pickup and delivery locations, all of it pointed to something far more sinister than legitimate medical transport. The hiccuping voices began to coordinate their efforts, timing their attempts at speech to create longer phrases by having different individuals contribute words in sequence. "Let us out," came through with crystal clarity, followed by "Please help us," and then a series of names that sounded like they were trying to identify themselves to anyone who might be listening. The desperation in their voices was unmistakable, even filtered through the strange condition that had befallen them, and I realized that they had probably been trying to attract attention for hours, maybe even days of transport. My hands were shaking now as I searched for somewhere safe to pull over and figure out what to do. The legal implications of my situation were staggering. Whether I was an unwitting accomplice to kidnapping or had stumbled into some form of illegal human experimentation. But the immediate moral imperative was clear. There were people suffering in my trailer who needed help, regardless of the consequences to my career or legal standing. The truck stop I'd been aiming for was still 20 miles away, but I could see what looked like an abandoned gas station coming up on the right, its dark windows and empty pumps offering at least some privacy to assess the situation. As I began to slow down for the exit, the hiccuping suddenly stopped completely, replaced by an ominous silence that was somehow more frightening than the strange chorus had been. The refrigeration unit continued its steady hum, but the human sounds that had been growing more desperate and coordinated simply vanished as if someone had thrown a switch. I coasted into the abandoned station's parking lot, my headlights illuminating broken concrete and tumbleweeds, while a terrible possibility occurred to me. Whatever process or substance had been used to create the hiccuping condition might be wearing off, or worse, something in my trailer might be monitoring the cargo and had detected my intention to stop and investigate. I brought the truck to a complete stop and engaged the parking brake, but left the engine running as I tried to decide my next move. The silence from the trailer was absolute now. Not even the sound of movement or breathing penetrating the insulated walls. Part of me hoped that I had imagined the entire episode, that road fatigue and isolation had created an auditory hallucination from the normal sounds of mechanical transport. But the memory of those coordinated pleas for help was too clear, too specific, too desperately human to dismiss as imagination. The signal and the static. From Marcus Chen, the long haul between Tucson and El Paso had always been my bread and butter. A stretch of desert highway that most drivers found monotonous, but that I'd grown to appreciate for its stark beauty and reliable solitude. My Peterbilt 379 hummed steadily through the night, its 18 wheels eating up the asphalt while classic rock played softly from the radio. The dashboard lights cast a familiar amber glow across the cab, and the gentle vibration of the engine had settled into that hypnotic rhythm that makes the miles disappear. It was well past midnight when I first noticed the radio acting strange. The classic rock station I'd been listening to began cutting in and out, replaced by bursts of static that seemed almost rhythmic. At first I thought it might be interference from a nearby radio tower, or maybe atmospheric conditions playing tricks with the signal. But as I reached for the tuning dial, something made me pause. The static wasn't random at all. It was pulsing in a deliberate pattern, short bursts followed by longer ones, then silence, then the pattern would repeat. I'd been a trucker for 15 years and a ham radio operator since I was 12, so I recognized Morse code when I heard it. The realization sent a small chill down my spine, not because Morse code was particularly unusual on the airwaves, but because this signal was coming through on an FM frequency where it had no business being. Amateur radio operators used entirely different bands, and commercial stations certainly didn't broadcast in code. I listened more carefully, trying to decode the message, but my Morse was rusty and the static made it difficult to distinguish the dits from the das. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, a ribbon of black asphalt illuminated only by my headlights and the occasional reflective mile marker. No other vehicles were visible in either direction, which wasn't unusual for this time of night on this particular stretch. The desert landscape rolled past in shadowy waves, dotted with the skeletal silhouettes of Joshua trees and saguaro cacti. Above, the sky was a tapestry of stars unmarred by light pollution, beautiful but somehow unsettling in its vastness. As I crested a small hill, I noticed lights in the distance off to my right, perhaps a mile or two from the highway. At first glance, they appeared to be the usual scatter of lights from a small desert community, or maybe a truck stop. But something about their behavior caught my attention. They were blinking, not the random flicker of faulty electrical connections or the steady pulse of warning beacons, but a deliberate, measured blinking that seemed oddly familiar. I eased off the accelerator slightly and watched the lights more carefully. Short blinks, long blinks, pauses, then the pattern repeated. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as understanding dawned. The lights were blinking in the same pattern as the static on my radio. Someone or something was transmitting the same Morse code message simultaneously through radio waves and visual signals, and both were reaching me here on this isolated stretch of highway. The logical part of my mind suggested it might be some kind of emergency beacon, perhaps from a downed aircraft or stranded motorist. But something about the situation felt wrong. Emergency signals typically used standard distress codes like SOS, and this pattern was longer, more complex. I pulled my truck over to the shoulder and grabbed the notepad I kept clipped to my sun visor, determined to decode whatever message was being sent. For the next 10 minutes I sat in my idling cab, windows down to catch any ambient sound, watching the distant lights and listening to the radio static while scribbling dots and dashes on paper. The desert air was cool and carried the faint scent of sage and creosote. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, a lonesome sound that seemed to emphasize the isolation of my position. The message repeated every few minutes with mechanical precision, and gradually I was able to piece together the individual letters. When I finally decoded the complete message, my blood ran cold. The lights were spelling out Marcus Chen over and over again. My name, my full name, repeated endlessly in Morse code through both radio static and distant blinking lights somewhere in the desert wilderness, where no one should know I was passing through. I checked my logbooks and GPS, confirming what I already knew. This route wasn't on my regular schedule. I'd taken this particular run as a favor to another driver who'd called in sick. A last-minute assignment that no one except my dispatcher should have known about. Even my wife thought I was running my usual route to Phoenix. Yet somehow, someone in the darkness was signaling specifically to me, using my name in a code that required significant knowledge to transmit properly. The radio crackled with fresh static, and I listened with growing dread as a new message began. This one was shorter, easier to decode. "Stop here," it said. "Stop here, Marcus Chen." The distant lights seemed to pulse more urgently now, and I realized they were positioned in what looked like an arrow formation, all pointing toward a dirt road that branched off from the highway about a quarter-mile ahead. Every instinct I possessed told me to put the truck in gear and drive away as fast as the big Caterpillar engine could manage. But morbid curiosity held me frozen. Who was sending these messages, and how did they know my name and location? The rational explanations were few and far between. Someone could have hacked into the trucking company's dispatch system, but that wouldn't explain how they'd positioned themselves in exactly the right spot, with equipment capable of transmitting on multiple frequencies. The timing was too precise, too coordinated to be coincidental. I sat there for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, engine idling, watching the lights blink my name repeatedly while the radio continued its coded whispers. The desert around me remained perfectly still except for the occasional gust of wind that rocked the truck gently on its springs. No other traffic appeared on the highway in either direction, leaving me alone with the mysterious signals and my growing sense of unease. Finally, against my better judgment, I reached for my CB radio and switched to channel 19, the standard trucker frequency. Breaker 19. This is Desert Runner looking for any drivers in the area of mile marker 127 on eastbound I-10. Anyone else seeing those lights south of the highway? Static answered me. I tried again on several other channels, but the airwaves remained silent except for the persistent Morse code signals. That's when I noticed movement in my mirrors. The lights that had been stationary in the distance were now mobile, flowing across the desert landscape like a constellation that had broken free from the sky. They maintained their blinking pattern but were clearly approaching the highway, and by extension approaching me. I could make out individual points of light now, perhaps a dozen or more, moving with purpose through the scrub brush and rocky terrain. My hand moved instinctively to the gear shifter, ready to drop the transmission into drive and flee, but something stopped me. The lights had arranged themselves into a perfect line paralleling the highway, staying carefully about 100 yards from the road. They continued their coded message, but now I could see they were mounted on vehicles of some kind, though the distance and darkness made it impossible to determine exactly what sort of vehicles they might be. The radio static intensified, and through the interference I began to hear something else. Voices, faint and distorted, speaking in what sounded like normal conversation, but the words were indistinct. I adjusted the tuning and volume, trying to clarify the signal, and gradually the voices became clearer. They were discussing coordinates, times, and what sounded like technical specifications for radio equipment. But most disturbing of all, they were talking about me. "Target acquired," one voice said through the static. "Marcus Chen, eastbound mile marker 127, solo driver in a blue Peterbilt. Signal strength optimal for Phase 2 initiation." Another voice responded with confirmation and what sounded like a countdown sequence. The professional, almost military tone of their communication sent ice water through my veins. I'd heard enough. Whatever elaborate setup this was, whether it was some kind of criminal operation, government surveillance, or something else entirely, I wanted no part of it. I released the parking brake and eased the truck back onto the highway, gradually building speed while keeping one eye on the parallel line of lights. For a moment they maintained their distance, continuing to blink their coded message. But as I approached highway speed, they began to converge on the road. The voices on the radio became more urgent, discussing intercept angles and timing windows. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing the truck well beyond the posted speed limit, but the lights were faster. They crossed the desert terrain with impossible ease, as if the rough ground posed no obstacle to whatever vehicles carried them. In my mirrors I could see them reaching the highway behind me, and now they were definitely in pursuit. The radio exploded with activity, multiple voices coordinating what was clearly a chase. They knew my truck specifications, my likely top speed, and even seemed to know about the slight engine hesitation I'd been meaning to have checked. The artist in seat 17. From Marcus Delacroix, the steady rhythm of diesel pistons had been my lullaby for 37 years on the road. But that October night between Baton Rouge and Little Rock, something changed in the familiar percussion. I was piloting my '98 Peterbilt through a maze of back highways, the kind truckers take when the interstates are clogged with construction and impatience. The old girl's cabin creaked with each pothole, a symphony I'd grown to love, but underneath it all, I kept hearing something else, a soft, persistent scratching that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The Greyhound station in Shreveport had been my last planned stop before the long haul north, but dispatch called with a rush job that couldn't wait until morning. Emergency passenger transport, they said. Some kind of medical situation that required immediate relocation to Arkansas. The paperwork was thin, just a manifest with a single name, A. Whitmore, and instructions to pick up at mile marker 127 on Highway 9. Not unusual for our company, we handled all kinds of specialized transport. When regular services couldn't accommodate, rain had been threatening all evening, and by the time I reached the designated pickup point, fat droplets were already drumming against my windshield in an irregular tattoo. The wipers swept back and forth with their hypnotic rhythm, clearing the glass just long enough for me to spot a figure standing beneath a flickering streetlight that cast more shadows than illumination. As I downshifted and brought the rig to a gentle stop, my headlights swept across someone wearing a long, dark coat that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The passenger climbed aboard without a word, moving with a peculiar fluid grace that reminded me of how fog drifts across a lake at dawn. I caught only a glimpse in my mirrors, pale hands, dark hair, and something about the way they held their head tilted slightly to one side, as if listening to music only they could hear. They settled into one of the seats toward the back of the passenger compartment, and I heard the soft whisper of fabric against upholstery as they made themselves comfortable. Evening, I called back through the partition. Should have you in Little Rock before sunrise if this weather holds. The response was so quiet I almost missed it, just a gentle murmur that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the wind finding its way through the cab's weather stripping. I adjusted my mirrors to keep an eye on my passenger, but the cabin lights were dim, and I could make out only a vague silhouette against the window. The first hour passed peacefully enough. The rain intensified into a proper downpour, turning the world beyond my windshield into a shifting watercolor painting of headlights and neon. The rhythmic swish of the wipers and the steady rumble of the engine created that cocoon of white noise that makes long-haul driving almost meditative. But gradually I became aware of that scratching sound again, more distinct now, coming definitely from the passenger compartment behind me. At first I dismissed it as nervous fidgeting. Some passengers aren't comfortable on long rides, especially at night, and they'll worry at their sleeves or tap their fingers or rustle through their belongings. But this sound was different, deliberate and methodical, with a rhythm all its own. It reminded me of the time I'd watched my grandmother's arthritic fingers trace patterns in the condensation on her kitchen window, over and over, as if she were writing invisible letters to someone who would never read them. When we stopped for fuel at a 24-hour truck stop outside of Marshall, Texas, I took the opportunity to check on my passenger. The scratching had continued without pause for nearly 2 hours, and I was beginning to worry that something might be wrong. Mental distress, perhaps, or some kind of compulsive behavior that required attention. The rain had softened to a steady drizzle, and the truck stop's sodium lights created pools of amber illumination across the wet asphalt. Climbed into the passenger compartment and immediately noticed that every window within reach of seat 17 was covered with what looked like drawings. Intricate flowing patterns spiraled across the glass surfaces, not etched or carved, but drawn in what appeared to be condensation, though the windows hadn't been fogged when we started the journey. The images were hauntingly beautiful in their complexity, intertwining vines that seemed to pulse with their own inner rhythm, faces that appeared and disappeared depending on the angle of view, and symbols that looked almost like letters from an alphabet I didn't recognize. My passenger sat perfectly still, one pale finger extended toward the window, moving in slow, precise motions across the glass. In the dim light, I couldn't make out their features clearly, but there was something about their posture that suggested complete absorption in their work, the kind of focused attention that artists achieve when they're channeling something beyond conscious thought. The scratching sound I'd been hearing was simply fingertip against glass, but it seemed to resonate through the entire cabin with an almost musical quality. "Those are beautiful," I said softly, not wanting to startle them. "Are you an artist?" For a moment the movement stopped, and I thought I saw their head turn slightly in my direction, but they didn't speak. Then the finger resumed its careful dance across the glass, adding new elements to the ever-growing composition. I noticed that their breath wasn't fogging the windows, despite the temperature differential between the cabin and the cool night air outside. Back in the driver's seat, I found myself glancing repeatedly in the mirrors, watching the hypnotic movement of that pale finger as it continued its work. The patterns seemed to be growing more complex, spreading across multiple windows now, and in the intermittent glow of passing streetlights, they appeared to shimmer and shift as if they were alive. The scratching sound had taken on an almost conversational quality, rising and falling in cadences that reminded me of whispered secrets or half-remembered lullabies. As we crossed into Arkansas, the rain stopped entirely, leaving the night crystal clear and filled with stars that seemed unusually bright. The sudden absence of water on the windshield made everything appear sharp and hyper-real, and I could see the passenger's reflection more clearly in the side mirrors. What I saw made me grip the steering wheel a little tighter and increase my attention to the road ahead. The reflection showed someone who seemed to be surrounded by a faint luminescence, as if they were lit from within by some gentle, otherworldly light. The drawings on the windows had become elaborate murals that covered every available inch of glass within the passenger's reach. Though I couldn't see all the details from my position, what was visible in the mirrors appeared to tell some kind of story, a visual narrative that unfolded from window to window like panels in a comic strip or frames in an animated film. There were landscapes that seemed to shift between earthly forests and alien geometries, figures that might have been human or might have been something else entirely, and always those flowing, vine-like patterns that connected everything together into a unified whole. The scratching sound began to change as we approached the Arkansas border, becoming more urgent, more insistent. Instead of the gentle, rhythmic drawing I'd grown accustomed to, it now sounded almost frantic, as if my passenger was running out of time to complete their work. I could hear their finger moving rapidly across the glass, creating new patterns at an accelerated pace, and occasionally there would be a pause followed by what sounded like a soft sigh of satisfaction or frustration. When I glanced in the mirror again, I noticed that the passenger had begun using both hands now, working simultaneously on different windows, creating interconnected designs that seemed to pulse and flow, even in the static medium of condensation on glass. The pale luminescence around them had grown brighter, and I could see their face clearly for the first time. Androgynous features that were beautiful in an otherworldly way, with large, dark eyes that seemed to hold depths of knowledge and sadness that no human face should contain. As we entered the outskirts of Little Rock, the scratching stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of that constant, gentle sound, and I found myself straining to hear any indication of what my passenger was doing. In the mirror, I could see them sitting perfectly still, hands folded in their lap, gazing out at their completed artwork with what appeared to be satisfaction. The drawings covered every window in the passenger compartment now, creating an elaborate gallery that transformed the mundane interior of the bus into something that resembled a chapel or cathedral dedicated to some unknown aesthetic, religion. The address I'd been given led me to a small medical facility on the edge of town, a nondescript building that looked more like an office complex than a hospital. As I pulled into the circular driveway, I noticed that all the windows were dark except for a few scattered lights that might have been security illumination or night shift workers. The parking lot was empty except for a handful of cars that looked like they'd been there for days rather than hours. Exit full of silence. From Marcus. The exit sign appeared in my headlights like a ghost materializing from the dark, its green reflective surface catching the beam and throwing it back with an almost ethereal glow. Exit 47, it read, followed by nothing. No town name, no services listed, no indication of what lay beyond the off-ramp that curved away into the blackness of the Alabama countryside. I'd been driving this route for 11 years, hauling everything from furniture to frozen goods up and down Interstate 65, and I'd never noticed Exit 47 before. The dashboard clock glowed 2:47 a.m. in soft blue numerals, and my eyes burned with the familiar ache of too many hours behind the wheel. My Peterbilt 379's engine hummed its steady diesel lullaby, a sound that had become as comforting as my own heartbeat over the years of long hauls. The CB radio crackled occasionally with the distant chatter of other night drivers, their voices thin and distorted by static and distance. Outside, the October air had turned cold enough that I could see my breath fog the side window when I glanced away from the road. I should have kept driving. Birmingham was still 3 hours south, and my delivery schedule didn't allow for unplanned stops. But something about that unmarked exit tugged at me with an inexplicable curiosity. In all my years of driving, I'd developed an almost supernatural sense for roads, for the familiar rhythm of highways and the personality that each stretch of asphalt seemed to possess. This exit felt different, felt wrong somehow, like a note played off-key in an otherwise familiar song. The decision made itself. I clicked on my turn signal, the steady tick-tick-tick joining the engine's rumble as I guided my rig down the off-ramp. The road curved gently to the right, descending through pine trees that pressed close on both sides like silent sentinels. My headlights carved a tunnel through the darkness, illuminating the weathered asphalt and the occasional reflector embedded in the road surface. The trees seemed older here, their branches heavy with Spanish moss that swayed gently in the night breeze. Despite the complete absence
of wind at ground level, the exit ramp ended at a
T-intersection with a narrow two-lane road that stretched in both directions into impenetrable darkness. No stop sign stood at the junction, no street signs indicated which way led where. The silence pressed against my windows like something alive, thick and oppressive in a way that made the normal sounds of my truck seem muffled and distant. Even the CB radio had gone quiet, producing only the soft hiss of empty frequencies. I turned left for no reason other than instinct, and the road ahead unfolded in my headlights like a ribbon laid across gently rolling hills. The asphalt was smooth and well-maintained, which struck me as odd for what appeared to be a rural back road in the middle of nowhere. No center line divided the lanes, and no shoulder marked the road's edge where it met the grass that grew thick and wild on both sides. The grass moved in waves despite the still air, rippling away from my headlight beams as if afraid of the light. After perhaps 10 minutes of driving, I spotted the first building. It sat back from the road about 50 yards, a small white structure that might have been a gas station or country store. No lights showed in its windows and no signs identified what it was or had been. As my headlights swept across its facade, I could see that the windows were boarded up with weathered plywood, and weeds grew tall around the foundation. But the building itself appeared to be in perfect condition, its white paint fresh and unblemished, as if it had been abandoned yesterday rather than years ago. More buildings began to appear as I continued down the road, each one set back from the asphalt and shrouded in the same strange darkness. A small church with a tall steeple, its white clapboard siding gleaming in my headlights. A row of houses, each one identical to its neighbors, with front porches and neat yards that looked recently maintained despite the obvious absence of any inhabitants. All of them were dark, all of them silent, and all of them appeared to be in that same peculiar state of simultaneous abandonment and perfect preservation. The road began to curve more frequently now, winding between the scattered buildings of what was clearly a town, though no welcome sign had announced its name or population. My speedometer showed I was maintaining a steady 35 miles per hour, but time seemed to stretch and distort in this place. The digital clock on my dashboard continued its steady progression, but the minutes felt like hours, and I began to lose track of how long I'd been driving through the silent community. That's when I noticed the people. They stood in yards and on porches, perfectly still figures that appeared in my headlights and vanished again as I passed. Men in work clothes, women in simple dresses, children in pajamas, all of them motionless as statues and facing the road. None of them moved as my truck rumbled past. None of them turned their heads to follow my passage, but I could feel their eyes tracking me through the darkness. The sensation of being watched crawled across my skin like cold fingers, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the warmth of the cab. I tried to focus on individual faces as my headlights swept over them, but the details seemed to slip away from my vision like water. They were there and not there simultaneously, present but somehow insubstantial, as if they existed in a space slightly removed from the world I occupied. The silence that surrounded them was absolute, broken only by the sound of my own engine and the whisper of tires on asphalt. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, startling me so badly that I jerked the wheel slightly to the right before correcting my course. But instead of the familiar voices of fellow drivers, the speaker emitted a sound I'd never heard before, a low humming that seemed to pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat. The sound grew gradually louder, and I reached for the volume control to turn it down, but my hand froze when I realized the humming wasn't coming from the radio at all. It was coming from outside, from the town itself, as if every building and every silent figure was contributing to a massive, coordinated chorus. The downtown area opened up ahead of me, a small business district with a bank, a pharmacy, a hardware store, and what appeared to be a small movie theater. All of the storefronts were dark, but their windows gleamed with an inner light that seemed to have no source. Vintage cars from the 1950s and 60s sat parked along the curbs, their chrome and paint immaculate despite their obvious age. Street lamps lined the main thoroughfare, their heads dark and unlit. Yet somehow the street itself seemed to glow with a pale luminescence that made my headlights seem dim and ineffectual. More people stood along the sidewalks now, dozens of them, all facing the street and all perfectly motionless. Their clothes spanned different eras, from the formal wear of the early 1900s to more casual attire from recent decades, as if this town had been collecting its silent residents for generations. Children stood next to elderly couples, teenagers next to middle-aged men in business suits, all of them united in their absolute stillness and their unwavering attention to my passage. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate now to reach the other end of town and find another road that would lead me back to the interstate. The engine responded with a deeper rumble, but my speedometer needle remained stubbornly fixed at 35 miles per hour, as if the town itself was controlling the pace of my passage through its borders. The humming grew louder, and I began to distinguish voices within it. Hundreds of voices joining together in a song without words. A melody that seemed to burrow into my brain and resonate in my bones. The downtown district fell behind me, replaced by residential streets lined with more houses and more silent figures. Each yard contained entire families, groups of people arranged in tableau-like scenes of suburban life, frozen in the act of living. A man pushing a lawnmower that would never finish cutting the grass, a woman hanging laundry that would never dry, children playing games that would never end. All of them watched me pass with eyes I couldn't quite see but could definitely feel. Then I saw the road ahead beginning to curve to the right, and hope flared in my chest as I realized I was approaching what appeared to be the town limits. The houses became sparser, the silent watchers fewer, and the oppressive weight of their attention began to lift slightly from my shoulders. The humming faded by degrees, replaced gradually by the familiar sounds of my truck and the normal operation of my CB radio, where distant voices once again crackled through the static. But as I rounded the final curve, my headlights illuminated a sight that made my blood freeze in my veins. There, directly ahead of me, stood a green highway sign that read, Exit 47, with an arrow pointing to the right. Wheels Against the World. From Marcus Chen. The thing about driving nights is that your mind starts playing tricks on you after the 5th cup of truck stop coffee and the 100th mile marker. At least that's what I told myself when I first noticed. The semi in my mirror spinning its wheels the wrong way. I've been hauling freight across the Pacific Northwest for 12 years now, and in all that time behind the wheel of my Peterbilt 379, I thought I'd seen every strange thing the highway could throw at me. Fog so thick it felt like driving through, cotton, deer that seemed to dance in headlight beams, and truckers who swore they'd seen things that couldn't possibly exist in the rational world of load schedules and delivery deadlines. But this was different. This was something that made my coffee taste like ash and my hands grip the steering wheel until my knuckles went white against the worn leather. The autumn rain had been drumming against my windshield for the better part of 3 hours, creating that hypnotic rhythm that can lull you into a dangerous trance if you let it. Route 101 stretched ahead like a black ribbon through the Oregon forest, illuminated only by the steady sweep of my wipers and the occasional flash of reflective road markers. My CB crackled with the usual late-night chatter between drivers, voices floating through the static like ghosts sharing stories from the road. I'd picked up the load in Portland that morning, 30,000 pounds of electronics bound for a distribution center in Sacramento. Nothing unusual about the cargo. Nothing that should have attracted attention from anyone or anything. The manifest was clean, the seals were intact, and my logbook showed I was well within my hours of service. Everything was by the book, exactly the way I preferred it. After my divorce 2 years ago, the predictability of long-haul trucking had become a comfort, each mile marker a small victory against the chaos that had consumed my personal life. The semi appeared in my mirrors somewhere around the town of Reedsport, materializing out of the rain-soaked darkness like it had been summoned from the asphalt itself. At first, I barely registered its presence. Another trucker working the graveyard, shift just like me, pushing through the weather to make a delivery deadline. The highways are full of us night owls, invisible to the daylight world, moving the goods that keep civilization humming along. But as the miles rolled by, something about the truck behind me began to gnaw at the edges of my consciousness like a splinter working its way deeper under the skin. It never got closer, never fell farther behind. It maintained a perfect following distance of maybe 200 yards, its headlights steady and unwavering through the curtain of rain. When I accelerated up hills, it kept pace. When I downshifted for curves, it matched my speed exactly. The precision was uncanny, almost mechanical in its consistency. Most drivers have their own rhythms, their own way of handling the road. Some ride the brakes too much, others push their rigs harder than they should. But this truck moved like It was connected to mine by an invisible chain. Every adjustment in my speed reflected perfectly in its response. That's when I started paying attention to the details, and that's when I noticed the wheels. In the glow of my taillights, reflected in the wet pavement and caught in the peripheral vision that long-haul drivers develop after years of watching their mirrors, I could see the truck's tires spinning, but they were spinning the wrong way. Not just wrong, but impossibly wrong. The laws of physics dictate that when a vehicle moves forward, its wheels rotate forward. It's so fundamental that we never think about it, like gravity or the need to breathe. Yet here was this semi, clearly moving in the same direction I was, its wheels turning backward as if it were being pulled by some unseen force rather than driven by its engine. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes with the back of my hand, and looked again. The effect persisted, clear as the rain streaking down my windows. The truck's wheels spun in reverse, defying every natural law I understood. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was an optical illusion caused by the strobing effect of my taillights. Maybe the rain on my mirrors was distorting the image. Maybe I was more tired than I thought, and my brain was processing visual information incorrectly. But deep in my gut, in that place where instinct lives and reason fears to tread, I knew I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. I reached for my CB radio, fingers trembling slightly as I adjusted the channel. My voice came out steadier than I felt when I called out into the night. "This is Big Blue eastbound on 101, mile marker 162. Anyone else seeing anything unusual out here tonight?" The response was immediate. A chorus of voices crackling through the static. Drivers reporting normal conditions, complaining about the weather, sharing the usual road gossip. No one had seen anything strange. No one had noticed the truck that was now impossibly close behind me, close enough that I could make out the outline of its cab through the rain. The details I could see made my blood run cold. The truck was a Kenworth, probably a W900, painted in a deep blue that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. There was no visible company name on the cab, no dot numbers that I could make out, no identifying marks that would help me track down the driver or the fleet it belonged to. The windshield was tinted so dark that I couldn't see inside, couldn't even make out the shadow of a driver. For all I knew, the cab could have been empty, the truck guided by some malevolent intelligence that had no need for human operators. The CB crackled again, and this time a voice I didn't recognize came through the speaker. It was calm, almost conversational, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. "Nice load you're carrying, Marcus. Electronics, isn't it? 30,000 pounds of the latest technology, all bound for California." The voice knew my name, it knew my cargo. It knew details that weren't available to anyone except me, the shipper, and the receiver. I hadn't shared that information over the CB, hadn't mentioned it to any other drivers. "Who is this?" I demanded, my voice tight with fear and anger. "How do you know my name?" But there was no response, just the whisper of static and the distant conversations of other truckers who seemed oblivious to what was happening. I checked my mirrors again, and the truck was still there. It's impossible. Wheels still spinning backward, still maintaining that perfect following distance that no human driver could achieve. Miles passed in a blur of rain and terror. The truck behind me never wavered, never showed any sign of turning off or pulling over. It followed me through every curve, matched every change in speed, stayed locked onto my route like a guided missile homing in on its target. I tried different tactics to shake it. I pulled into a rest area, hoping it would continue past, but it followed me into the parking lot and sat idling 50 feet away, its wheels still spinning the wrong direction even though it wasn't moving. I merged back onto the highway and floored it, pushing my Peterbilt up to speeds that were dangerous in the wet conditions, but the phantom truck kept pace effortlessly. The fuel gauge on my dashboard showed I was running low, the needle hovering just above the quarter mark. There was a truck stop ahead, a pilot station that I'd used dozens of times during my runs through Oregon. Maybe there would be other drivers there, witnesses who could see what I was seeing, confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind to highway hypnosis and too much caffeine. But as I signaled for the exit, preparing to pull off the highway, the voice came through my CB again, clearer this time, closer. "Don't stop, Marcus. Keep driving. You have something that belongs to us, and we intend to collect it." The transmission ended with a sound that wasn't quite static, wasn't quite laughter, but something in between that made my hand shake on the steering wheel. I ignored the voice and took the exit anyway, my trailer swaying slightly on the wet ramp as I downshifted and applied the brakes. Behind me, the mysterious truck followed, its backward spinning wheels somehow gripping the pavement with perfect traction. The truck stop was nearly empty, just a few scattered vehicles parked under the harsh fluorescent lights that turned the rain into silver needles. I pulled up to a diesel pump and shut down my engine. The sudden silence after hours of road noise almost deafening. The truck behind me parked at the next island over, its engine continuing to idle with a sound that was wrong somehow. Too smooth, too quiet, like it was powered by something other than diesel fuel and combustion. I climbed down from my cab, my legs stiff from hours of driving, and approached the rear of my trailer to check the seals. Everything appeared normal. The locks were intact, the documentation was in order, the cargo was secure. But as I walked around my rig, I became aware of a presence watching me. The breathing wire. From Marcus Chen, the CB radio had been acting strange for 3 nights running, crackling with static that sounded almost like breathing, and I was starting to think maybe it was time to have the whole unit replaced when I pulled into the truck stop outside Barstow. The desert stretched endlessly in all directions under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, and the only sounds were the distant hum of the interstate and the soft tick of my cooling engine. I'd been running freight between Phoenix and Los Angeles for the better part of 15 years, and this particular stretch of highway had always felt lonely. But tonight there was something different in the air, something that made the hair on my arm stand up even in the warm desert breeze. I'd first noticed the strange breathing sounds 2 nights ago, somewhere between Flagstaff and Kingman, when the CB had suddenly come alive with what I'd initially mistaken for someone keying their mic without speaking. The sound was rhythmic and deep, like someone drawing long, labored breaths, and it would continue for minutes at a time before cutting out abruptly. The first time it happened, I'd tried to respond, asking if anyone needed assistance, but there was never any reply, just that slow, measured breathing that seemed to fill the cab of my Kenworth like a living presence. Last night, the breathing had grown more pronounced, more deliberate somehow, and I'd started to notice that it seemed to respond to my movements. When I would reach for my coffee cup, the breathing would quicken slightly, and when I adjusted my mirrors or changed lanes, it would pause for a moment before resuming with what I could only describe as increased intensity. I told myself it was just coincidence. Maybe some trucker with a faulty radio who didn't realize his mic was stuck open. But deep down I knew there was something more unsettling about the whole situation. Now, parked at the truck stop with my engine off and the desert silence pressing in around me, I found myself staring at the CB radio mounted above my dashboard, its small green LED glowing steadily in the darkness. The breathing hadn't started yet tonight, but I could feel an anticipation building in the air like the charged atmosphere before a thunderstorm. I reached for the handset, hesitating for a moment before keying the mic and speaking into the quiet night. Breaker 19. This is eastbound Marcus on the 140. Anybody out there having trouble with their radio equipment? My voice sounded unusually loud in the confined space of the cab, and I waited for a response, watching the LED flicker as other drivers replied with their usual chatter about road conditions and fuel prices. Everything seemed normal for a few minutes, just the familiar voices of long-haul drivers passing information back and forth across the desert highways, and I was beginning to think that maybe whatever had been causing the strange breathing sounds had finally resolved itself. Then, just as I was about to set the handset back in its cradle, the breathing started again. But this time it was different, more focused somehow, as if whoever or whatever was making the sound was directing it specifically at me. The rhythm was slower than before, deeper, and I could hear what sounded almost like words hidden in the exhalation, though I couldn't quite make out what they were saying. I turned up the volume on the CB, leaning closer to the speaker, and that's when I heard it clearly for the first time. "Marcus," the voice whispered on the exhale so softly that it was barely audible above the static. "Marcus Chen, Kenworth T680, Arizona plates." The word sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night air, because there was no way anyone should have been able to see my truck or my license plates from wherever they were broadcasting. I grabbed the handset again, my hands shaking slightly as I keyed the mic. "Who is this? How do you know my name?" I demanded, but there was no response except for that slow, steady breathing that seemed to be coming from somewhere much closer than any radio transmission should have been. The sound filled the cab completely now, as if the source was sitting right there beside me, and I found myself looking around the interior of my truck, checking the sleeper berth and the passenger seat, even though I knew I was alone. The breathing continued for several more minutes, and with each exhale I could hear more details about my life whispered into the static. My home address in Tucson, the name of the freight company I worked for, even the fact that I'd been divorced for 3 years and lived alone in a small apartment near the rail yards. Information that no casual observer could have known. Details that made my skin crawl with the realization that someone had been watching me, studying me, learning intimate facts about my personal life. I tried switching channels, cycling through the CB frequencies to escape the strange transmission, but the breathing followed me to every channel, growing louder and more insistent with each change. Channel 9, Channel 19, even the emergency frequency, they were all filled with that same slow rhythmic sound that seemed to be emanating from somewhere inside my own radio equipment. I reached for the power switch, thinking I could simply turn the unit off and drive away from whatever was happening, but my hand froze when the voice spoke again, clearer this time, with an urgency that made my blood run cold. "Don't turn it off, Marcus," the voice said during a particularly long exhale, and I could hear what sounded like genuine concern in the whispered words. "I need you to listen very carefully, because there isn't much time left, and there are things you need to know about the road ahead, about the danger that's waiting for you between here and your destination." Against every instinct that told me to shut off the radio and drive away as fast as possible, I found myself reaching for the handset again, drawn into the strange conversation despite my fear. "What kind of danger? Who are you, and what do you want from me?" The questions tumbled out of me in a rush, and I realized that my own breathing had become quick and shallow, matching the rhythm of whatever was speaking to me through the CB. The response came not in words but in images that seemed to flow directly into my mind through the radio waves. Visions of a section of highway about 50 miles ahead, where the road curved sharply through a narrow canyon. I could see my own truck approaching the curve at highway speed, and I could see something else waiting there in the darkness, something that didn't belong on any earthly roadway. The image was hazy and indistinct, but there was a sense of malevolent intelligence about it, a predatory awareness that focused on passing vehicles like a spider waiting in its web. "Exit at Ludlow," the breathing voice instructed, and I could hear what sounded like genuine urgency in the whispered words. "Take the old highway north for exactly 12 miles, then turn around and come back. Don't ask questions, don't try to understand. Just do as I'm telling you if you want to see tomorrow morning." The transmission cut out abruptly after that, leaving me alone with the normal chatter of the CB and the sound of my own rapid breathing in the sudden silence. I sat there for a long time, engine idling, trying to decide what to do. Every logical part of my mind told me that what I'd experienced was impossible, just some elaborate prank, or maybe the result of too many hours on the road without adequate sleep. But there had been something about the voice, something about the way it had spoken my name and known details about my life. that convinced me this was more than just someone playing games on the radio. In the end, it was the fear in the voice that decided me, the genuine concern I'd heard when it warned me about the road ahead. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the interstate. But instead of continuing west toward Los Angeles as I'd planned, I took the exit at Ludlow just as the voice had instructed. The old highway stretched north into the desert like a ribbon of cracked asphalt, and I drove exactly 12 miles before pulling over and turning around, the whole detour adding nearly an hour to my trip. When I finally rejoined the interstate and continued west, I passed the canyon section where the voice had shown me the waiting danger. And everything looked perfectly normal in my headlights. Just empty road and desert landscape, no sign of anything unusual or threatening. But as I drove through that particular stretch of highway, my CB radio crackled to life one final time, and I heard what sounded like a sigh of relief whispered into the static, followed by words that I still think about during every trip through that part of Arizona. "Thank you for listening, Marcus," the voice said, and for the first time it sounded almost human, almost familiar. "Maybe next time you'll understand that some warnings are worth heeding, even when they come from places you don't expect." The transmission faded after that, and I never heard the breathing voice again, though I still keep my CB radio on whenever I'm driving through the desert, just in case someone else needs help from whatever watches over the lonely highways in the dark hours before dawn. The Watcher's Highway. From Marcus. The thing about driving long haul is that after 23 years behind the wheel, you think you've seen everything the highways have to offer. Every truck stop diner with its flickering neon sign and bitter coffee. Every stretch of empty asphalt that runs through forgotten towns where time seems to have stopped somewhere around 1987. You get comfortable with the rhythm of it all, the gentle sway of your rig cutting through the darkness, the steady thrum of 18 wheels eating up mile after mile of American blacktop. That comfort, though, can make you careless about the things that don't quite fit the pattern. I was hauling refrigerated produce from the Central Valley up through Oregon, a routine run I'd made maybe 200 times before. My Peterbilt was running smooth as silk, the kind of night where everything feels right with the world. The October air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of harvested fields and the first promise of winter. Stars stretched across the sky like scattered diamonds, and the highway ahead was mostly empty, just the way I prefer it. Interstate 5 can be a nightmare during daylight hours, but at 2 in the morning, it belongs to drivers like me who understand its moods and temperament. The CB radio crackled softly with occasional chatter from other night haulers, voices floating through the static like lonely ghosts checking in with one another. There's a camaraderie among us nocturnal travelers, an unspoken understanding that we're all just trying to make our miles while the rest of the world sleeps. The familiar voices of regular drivers drifted through the airwaves, sharing information about speed traps, road conditions, and the quality of coffee at various truck stops along the route. It was the kind of peaceful night that makes you grateful for the solitude and the endless ribbon of road stretching ahead. That's when I first noticed the trailer in my mirrors, maybe a quarter mile back, matching my speed with an almost mechanical precision that struck me as oddly professional. In this business, you develop a sixth sense about the vehicles around you, especially the ones that maintain their distance too perfectly. Most drivers have their own rhythm, speeding up slightly on downhill grades, slowing just a touch when the road curves or when fatigue starts to set in. But this trailer behind me held its position like it was connected to my rig by an invisible chain, maintaining exactly the same following distance through every minor variation in my speed. The first thing that caught my attention was the headlight situation. From what I could see in my mirrors, there was only one light cutting through the darkness, a single brilliant beam that seemed unusually bright and perfectly centered. I figured the driver had lost a headlight and was running on high beam to compensate, something that happens often enough out here where getting repairs can mean a costly delay. Plenty of drivers push their luck with mechanical issues rather than lose time and money sitting in some small town garage waiting for parts. Still, Something about the quality of that light bothered me in a way I couldn't quite articulate. A nagging feeling that settled in the back of my mind like an itch I couldn't reach. As the miles rolled by and we climbed into the foothills, that single light never wavered, never bobbed or shifted the way headlights do when a truck hits bumps or slight irregularities in the road surface. It remained perfectly steady, like a lighthouse beam cutting through the night, and I found myself glancing at my mirrors more frequently than usual. The light had an almost hypnotic quality, bright and unwavering, and I started to notice that it didn't seem to illuminate the road around it the way headlights should. Instead, it appeared to exist in isolation, a brilliant point of light floating in the darkness with no apparent source or context. When we reached a long straightaway, I decided to get a better look at my mysterious follower. I eased off the throttle slightly, hoping the driver would pass or at least close the distance enough for me to see more details about the rig. Most professional drivers would take the hint and go around, especially on a clear stretch of highway with good visibility, but instead of passing, the trailer simply slowed to match my reduced speed, maintaining that exact same following distance with an almost supernatural precision that sent a small chill down my spine. The single light continued to burn steadily in my mirrors, offering no additional details about the vehicle carrying it. The CB radio had gone quiet, which was unusual for this time of night and this stretch of highway. Normally, there would be at least some scattered conversation among the handful of drivers working the overnight routes, but the airwaves had fallen into an eerie silence that seemed to press against the windows of my cab. I tried raising someone on Channel 19, the trucker frequency, just to break the uncomfortable quiet that had settled over the night like a heavy blanket. Breaker 19, this is Northbound Pete looking for a radio check, I called, but received nothing back except the soft hiss of static and the feeling that my words had disappeared into an empty void. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the road began to curve more frequently, winding through stands of tall pine trees that created deep shadows on either side of the highway. The single light behind me moved through these curves with a fluid motion that didn't match the behavior of any truck I'd ever seen. It flowed around the bends like liquid mercury, never varying in intensity or direction, never showing the characteristic swing and sweep of headlights following the contours of a winding road. Truck headlights bounce and shift as the cab leans into curves, creating moving patterns of light and shadow, but this solitary beam remained as fixed and steady as the North Star. My hands tightened on the steering wheel as an uncomfortable realization began to form in the back of my mind. In all my years of driving, through every kind of weather and road condition, I had never seen a headlight behave the way this one was behaving. It moved with an organic quality, almost like it was watching the road ahead with intention rather than simply illuminating it. The more I observed it in my mirrors, the more convinced I became that what I was seeing wasn't a headlight at all, but something else entirely, something that defied easy explanation or rational categorization. When we crested a particularly steep grade, I finally got my first clear view of the trailer that had been following me. What I saw made my blood run cold and caused me to grip the wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. The trailer was enormous, much larger than any legal load I'd ever encountered, stretching back into the darkness like a metallic whale. But it was the front of the trailer that made my mouth go dry with fear. Where there should have been a tractor unit, where any normal semi would have its cab and engine, there was instead a massive eye, easily 8 feet in diameter, with a pupil that seemed to contain depths of darkness I couldn't begin to fathom. The eye was perfectly round and disturbingly biological in appearance, complete with what looked like veined tissue around the edges and a wet, glistening surface that reflected the starlight. The pupil was enormous and completely black, surrounded by an iris that shifted between deep brown and amber, like polished wood grain with flecks of gold. There were no wheels visible beneath the front of this abomination, no axles or suspension components, just that terrible watching eye that seemed to be focused directly on my truck, with an intelligence that felt ancient and malevolent. As I stared in horrified fascination, The eye blinked with a sound like wet leather slapping against stone, a noise that somehow carried over the rumble of my diesel engine and the whistle of wind around my cab. The massive lid descended slowly, revealing pale flesh beneath, then lifted again to expose that terrible black pupil that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The blink lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but in that time I felt as though I was being examined, catalogued, and found to be something of interest to whatever intelligence existed behind that impossible organ. My CB radio suddenly crackled to life with a voice that wasn't quite human, words formed by something that had learned to mimic human speech, without understanding the underlying emotion or inflection that makes voices recognizable as coming from living throats. "Good evening, driver," the voice said, each word perfectly enunciated but completely devoid of warmth or humanity. "You have such interesting cargo. We have been watching your route with great attention and considerable anticipation." I fumbled for the microphone with shaking hands, my voice coming out as barely more than a whisper when I managed to key the radio. "Who is this? What do you want?" The question sounded pathetic even to my own ears. The desperate inquiries of someone whose understanding of reality had just been fundamentally shattered by something that shouldn't exist in any rational universe. "We are collectors," the voice responded immediately, as if it had been waiting for my question with infinite patience. "Your cargo contains specimens we require for our research. Please reduce your speed and prepare to transfer your load to our facility. Cooperation will ensure that this process remains pleasant for all parties involved, though we should mention that resistance has historically proven to be quite futile." The fog that remembers. From Marcus Chen, the sleeper cab of my Peterbilt has always been my sanctuary, a small slice of home wrapped in steel and chrome as I hauled freight across the endless highways of America. 23 years I've been driving these routes, and in all that time I've learned to read the road like scripture, to feel the pulse of my engine like my own heartbeat. But what happened last Tuesday night on that stretch of Highway 101, between Eureka and Crescent City, has left me questioning everything I thought I knew about the miles that have become my life. I was running late on a delivery of redwood, lumber to a construction company up in Oregon, the kind of load that pays well, but demands you push through the night when fog rolls in thick off the Pacific. The weather had been clear when I started my mandatory rest period at a truck stop just south of Eureka, the kind of place where the coffee tastes like motor oil and the fluorescent lights buzz with the persistence of dying insects. My logbook showed I had exactly 10 hours before I could legally get back on the road, so I settled into my sleeper with a paperback novel and a thermos of decent coffee I'd brought from home. The sleeper was nothing fancy, just a narrow bunk with storage compartments and a small ventilation system that usually kept the air circulating nicely. I'd customized it over the years with a few personal touches. A photo of my late wife Sarah taped to the wall, a small reading lamp, and blackout curtains that could turn the space darker than a moonless night when I needed to sleep during the day. The engine was idling with that steady diesel rumble that had become as comforting as a lullaby, and through the slightly cracked window, I could hear the distant sound of other trucks settling in for their own mandatory breaks. Around midnight, I noticed the first wisps. At first, I thought it might be steam from my thermos or perhaps cigarette smoke drifting in from another driver, though I kept my windows barely cracked and had quit smoking years ago when Sarah got sick. The fog was barely visible, just thin tendrils that seemed to seep through the ventilation system with an almost purposeful quality. I adjusted the air circulation, thinking maybe the system was pulling in moisture from outside, but the wisps continued to gather in the corners of my sleeper like spider webs made of mist. The fog had an odd quality to it, not quite the thick marine layer I was used to seeing roll in off the ocean, but something more ethereal, more deliberate in its movements. It seemed to pool in the lower corners of the sleeper first, then gradually begin to rise like invisible water filling a tank. Within an hour, the fog had reached the level of my bunk, and I found myself peering down into what looked like a miniature cloud system contained within the walls of my truck. The temperature hadn't changed, and there was no condensation on the windows or walls, which struck me as peculiar for fog this dense. As I watched, fascinated despite a growing sense of unease, the fog began to take on subtle variations in density and movement. Patches would swirl and eddy as if stirred by currents I couldn't feel, and occasionally I would catch glimpses of what almost looked like shapes forming and dissolving within the mist. At first I convinced myself it was pareidolia, the same phenomenon that makes us see faces in clouds or imagine monsters in shadows. But the shapes were becoming more persistent, more defined, and they seemed to be reaching upward toward where I lay on my bunk. The fog continued to rise throughout the night, and with it came something else entirely unexpected: voices. Not the usual sounds of a truck stop at night, not the rumble of distant engines or the chatter of drivers grabbing late dinners, but whispered conversations that seemed to emanate from within the mist itself. The words were indistinct at first, like overhearing a conversation in another room, but gradually they became clearer, more focused, and infinitely more disturbing. They were talking about routes I had driven, loads I had carried, stops I had made at truck stops and way stations across dozens of states. One voice, thin and reedy like wind through telephone wires, mentioned a delivery I had made to a paper mill in Oregon 3 months earlier. Another, deeper and more resonant, described in perfect detail a breakdown I had experienced outside of Bakersfield 2 years ago when my transmission had given out on a scorching summer afternoon. A third voice, this one with an accent I couldn't place, recounted a conversation I had with a waitress at a diner in Nevada, word for word, including details I had forgotten myself until that moment when the fog brought them rushing back with uncomfortable clarity. The fog had reached the level of my mattress now, swirling around my legs with a consistency that felt neither warm nor cold, but somehow neutral, as if it existed at the exact temperature of my own body. When I tried to wave it away, my hands passed through it without any resistance. Yet it seemed to cling to my skin with an almost magnetic quality. The voices were becoming more numerous now, a chorus of whispered memories that painted a picture of my life on the road with an accuracy that no stranger should possess. I heard my own voice then, preserved somehow in the mist, talking to Sarah on the phone during what I now realized must have been our last conversation before she went into the hospital. The fog had captured not just my words, but the exact tone. The way my voice had cracked slightly when she told me the doctors wanted to run more tests. The pause before I promised to come home early from that run to Arizona. Hearing it again, replayed by this impossible archive of vapor, brought tears to my eyes and a chill to my heart that had nothing to do with temperature. The fog continued its relentless rise until it had filled the sleeper completely, leaving me floating in a sea of memories that weren't quite my own anymore. The voices were all around me now, some recounting conversations I remembered, others describing moments I had forgotten, and still others speaking of events I couldn't recall at all, but which felt undeniably true when spoken aloud in that ethereal chorus. It was as if the fog had been collecting these fragments of lives lived on the highway, gathering the exhaled words and whispered thoughts of drivers who had slept in this cab before me. That's when I began to understand what I was experiencing. This wasn't my truck, not originally. I had bought it used from a dealer in Nevada 5 years ago. But before that, it had belonged to other drivers, men and women who had made this same sleeper their temporary home as they crossed the country with loads of freight and cargo. The fog wasn't just random moisture. It was the accumulated breath of all those drivers, their words and dreams and fears somehow preserved in the very air of this small space, waiting for the right conditions to manifest themselves once again. I could feel myself becoming part of it, my own breath mixing with the fog, my own whispered words joining the chorus that surrounded me. Every time I exhaled, I could sense fragments of my conversations, my thoughts, my memories being absorbed into this growing archive of highway life. The fog was patient, methodical in its collection, and I realized with growing horror that it would eventually preserve everything. Every word I had ever spoken within these walls, every dream I had dreamed on this narrow bunk. The voices were becoming more insistent now, more immediate, as if the fog was reaching some kind of critical mass where past and present began to blur together. I heard myself ordering coffee at the truck stop just hours earlier, but also heard another version of my voice from what must have been years in the future, describing this very night to someone whose voice I didn't recognize. The fog had become temporal, collecting not just memories but possibilities, potential conversations that existed somewhere in the quantum uncertainty of might be, fighting against every instinct that told me to remain still. I forced myself to move through the thick mist toward where I remembered the cab door being located. The fog seemed to resist my movement, not physically but psychologically, flooding my mind with memories that made it difficult to focus on the present moment. I saw Sarah again, young and healthy, laughing at something I had said over dinner at a restaurant whose name I couldn't remember. I felt the satisfaction of completing a particularly difficult delivery, the relief of finding a parking space at a crowded truck stop, the loneliness of knowing I had hundreds of miles still to drive before I could go home. My hand finally found the door handle, and when I pulled it open, the fog rushed out into the night like water through a broken dam. The sudden influx of cool air cleared my head immediately, and I stumbled out onto the parking lot of the truck stop, gasping and disoriented. Behind me I could hear the fog being pulled away by the evening breeze, taking with it the voices and memories that had filled my sleeper with their impossible presence. When I turned back to look at my truck, everything appeared normal. The sleeper was clear, the air circulation system humming quietly, and there was no sign of the supernatural archive that had nearly claimed me. But when I checked my logbook, I discovered that 10 hours had passed exactly, down to the minute, as if the fog had been keeping perfect time, even as it existed outside the normal, the mirror mile. From Jake Morrison. The thing about driving the same routes for 15 years is that you start to know every mile marker, every pothole, every curve like the lines on your own palm. Highway 287 through the Nevada desert had been my regular run for the better part of a decade, hauling electronics from Reno to Las Vegas 3 times a week in my trusty Peterbilt. The engine's steady rumble had become my lullaby, the dashboard lights my constellation, and the endless ribbon of asphalt my second home. It was a Tuesday night in October when everything I thought I knew about that familiar stretch of highway began to unravel like cheap tire tread on hot pavement. The air had that crisp bite that comes just before winter settles into the high desert, and my breath fogged slightly as I climbed into the cab around 11:30. The load was standard, nothing special, just pallets of computer parts bound for a warehouse in Henderson. I'd driven this exact route 847 times before, not that anyone was counting except me and my logbook. The first 100 miles passed without incident, just the way I liked it. My CB crackled occasionally with chatter from other drivers, mostly complaints about a construction zone up near Carson City and warnings about a speed trap around mile marker 23. The radio played that mix of classic rock and country that seems to exist only in the space between midnight and dawn, when the world belongs to long-haul truckers and insomniacs. My thermos of coffee was still warm. My fuel gauge sat comfortably above half, and the road stretched ahead like a promise of another routine night. That's when I noticed the first peculiarity, somewhere around mile marker 78, where the highway makes that long, sweeping curve past the abandoned gas station with the broken neon sign. As my headlights swept across the desert, I caught sight of something that made me do a double take. There, maybe a quarter mile ahead, was another truck, same model Peterbilt as mine, same configuration, hauling what looked like an identical trailer. In 15 years of driving, you learn to recognize other rigs from a distance, and this one looked remarkably similar to my own. I eased off the throttle slightly, letting the gap between us remain constant. The other truck maintained a steady speed, its taillights glowing like red eyes in the darkness. Every few seconds I could make out details in the glow of my headlights. The same mud flaps, the same chrome bumper, even what appeared to be the same company logo on the back of the trailer. Coincidences happen in trucking, especially when you're hauling for one of the big electronics distributors. But something about the similarity nagged at me like a stone in my boot. The miles ticked by, and the other truck stayed exactly the same distance ahead, matching my speed with mechanical precision. When I accelerated slightly to close the gap, the truck ahead seemed to accelerate as well. When I backed off, it slowed down correspondingly. I tried reaching out on the CB, switching through channels and calling out to see if the driver would respond, but got nothing back except static and the distant chatter of truckers hundreds of miles away. Around mile marker 95, where the highway crests a small hill before descending into a valley dotted with Joshua trees, I got my first clear look at the license plate of the truck ahead. My hands tightened on the steering wheel and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the door seals. The plate read exactly the same as mine, letter for letter, number for number. I blinked hard, thinking maybe the late hour was playing tricks with my vision, but when I looked again, there it was, plain as daylight under the glow of my headlights. I reached for my CB radio and tried multiple channels, calling out with increasing urgency. "This is Big Jake eastbound on 287 at mile 96, calling the Peterbilt ahead of me. Come back if you copy." Nothing but static and the occasional burst of distant conversation. I tried again and again, but the truck ahead continued its steady pace as if completely unaware of my presence behind it. The desert landscape began to feel different as we continued east. The familiar landmarks seemed somehow altered, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what had changed. The rock formations looked the same but felt wrong, like viewing photographs of your childhood home taken from slightly different angles. The abandoned truck stop at mile 103 appeared exactly where it should, its broken windows and rusted pumps catching my headlights, but something about its orientation seemed reversed, as if I were seeing its mirror image. That's when the really unsettling part began. As we approached mile marker 110, I realized I should be seeing the lights of a small town called Desert Springs off to the south. It was nothing more than a truck stop, a diner, and a handful of houses, but its lights were always visible from the highway. Instead, I saw those same lights, but they appeared to the north on the wrong side of the road entirely. I grabbed my atlas from the passenger seat and flicked on the dome light, studying the familiar route with shaking fingers. According to every map I'd ever seen, Desert Springs was definitely south of the highway, not north. The truck ahead maintained its exact distance, and I found myself falling into an almost hypnotic rhythm, following those red taillights through the darkness. The white lines on the asphalt seemed to blur and shift in my peripheral vision, and I had to shake my head several times to stay focused. The engine's steady rumble took on an almost musical quality, harmonizing with itself in ways that didn't seem physically possible. Mile marker 125 should have marked the beginning of a long straightaway that led toward the state line, but instead, the road began to curve in a wide arc to the left. I'd driven this stretch hundreds of times, and there was no curve there, just 5 miles of straight highway across flat desert. Yet here I was, following the truck ahead through a sweeping turn that shouldn't exist, past rock formations I'd never seen before, but which seemed hauntingly familiar. I tried my cell phone, thinking maybe I could call dispatch and ask if they had any other drivers on this route, but the screen showed no signal. That wasn't unusual out here in the middle of nowhere, but the timing felt ominous. I was completely cut off, following a phantom truck through a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and impossible. The curve continued for what felt like miles, and gradually I began to recognize landmarks, but they were appearing in reverse order. There was the abandoned gas station with the broken neon sign, but now it was on the left side of the road instead of the right. There was the Joshua tree that looked like a man with his arms raised, but it was leaning the opposite direction. Mile marker 78 flashed by in my headlights, though I was certain I'd passed it hours ago. A horrible realization began to creep over me like ice water in my veins. The truck I was following wasn't just similar to mine, it was identical in every detail because it was mine. Somehow, impossibly, I was following myself along a highway that had folded back on itself like a ribbon, twisted into a Mobius strip. The driver ahead was me, and I was the driver behind, trapped in an endless loop of asphalt and desert and darkness. I pressed harder on the accelerator, desperate to catch up to myself, to break whatever supernatural cycle had trapped me on this impossible road. The speedometer climbed past 75, past 80, but the distance between the trucks remained constant. In my mirrors, I caught glimpses of headlights following at the same exact distance I was maintaining behind the truck ahead. 3 trucks now, or maybe it was still just one, reflected infinitely like standing between parallel mirrors. The CB radio suddenly crackled to life, and I heard my own voice, distorted by static but unmistakably mine, calling out on Channel 19. "This is Big Jake eastbound on 287, calling the Peterbilt ahead of me. Come back if you copy." I grabbed the microphone with trembling fingers and responded to myself, but the words that came out were the same ones I'd spoken hours earlier, and I realized with growing horror that I had no control over what I was saying. Mile markers flashed by in reverse sequence. 95, 90, 85, counting backward toward some unknown destination. The fuel gauge, which had been above half when this nightmare began, now hovered near a quarter tank. I was burning fuel in this endless loop, and eventually, inevitably, I would run out. What would happen then? Would I coast to a stop and watch myself disappear into the distance, only to see my own headlights approaching from behind? Or would the truck behind run out of fuel at exactly the same moment? All of us trapped in perfect synchronization. Desert Springs appeared again, its lights now back on the southern side of the highway where they belonged, and for a moment I felt a surge of hope. Maybe the loop was breaking. Maybe I was finding my way back to the real Highway 287, the mirror that burns. From Jake Morrison. The chrome mirror on my Peterbilt has been with me for 15 years, bolted to the passenger side since the day I bought her used from a depot in Amarillo. It's seen more miles than most people see in a lifetime, reflected countless sunrises over wheat fields and mountain passes, shown me the faces of fellow drivers at truck stops from Maine to Oregon. But tonight, as I roll through the humid darkness of southern Louisiana, that mirror is showing me something that shouldn't exist. I first noticed it around midnight, somewhere between Baton Rouge and Lafayette on Interstate 10. The rain had been falling steadily for hours, turning the world beyond my windshield into a blur of red taillights and yellow road markers. The rhythmic thump of my wipers and the steady hum of the diesel engine beneath me had settled into that hypnotic pattern that makes the miles disappear, when a flicker of orange light caught my peripheral vision in the passenger mirror. At first, I assumed it was just another semi behind me, maybe running those amber clearance lights that some drivers favor, or perhaps the glow from a distant truck stop bleeding through the rain-soaked air. But when I glanced directly at the mirror, the highway behind me looked exactly as it should. Dark asphalt glistening with rainwater, the occasional pair of headlights cutting through the night, the familiar dance of late-night traffic making its way across the Gulf Coast. I adjusted my grip on the steering wheel and pushed the strange vision from my mind. 15 hours on the road can play tricks on tired eyes, and I'd been driving longer runs lately, trying to make up for the slow season. The load of electronics I was hauling from Houston to Jacksonville had to be there by noon Thursday, and the weather wasn't helping my schedule. Better to focus on the road ahead than worry about phantom lights in my mirrors. But the orange glow returned an hour later, stronger this time, flickering like flames dancing in the reflection. When I turned my head to look directly behind me through the rear window of the cab, I saw nothing unusual, just the dark bulk of my trailer and the wet highway stretching back into the Louisiana night. Yet when I looked back at the passenger mirror, there they were again, tongues of fire licking at the edges of the reflection, their light casting strange shadows that seemed to move independently of any source. The coffee in my thermos had long since gone cold, but I poured another cup anyway, hoping the caffeine would sharpen my focus. The CB radio crackled occasionally with the voices of other drivers sharing weather updates and road conditions, their familiar drawls and trucker slang somehow comforting in the growing strangeness of the night. I considered keying the mic to ask if anyone else was seeing unusual lights, but what would I say? That my mirror was showing me fires that weren't there? As I crossed the Atchafalaya Basin, the flames in the mirror grew more distinct. What had started as vague orange flickers now resolved into actual fire. Tall columns of flame rising from what appeared to be the road surface itself, their heat seeming to shimmer even in the reflection. The strangest part was how realistic they looked, complete with the characteristic blue cores and orange-white tips that I remembered from the oil field fires I'd seen during my younger days working the Texas Panhandle. The wind picked up, buffeting my 18-wheeler and requiring constant small corrections to the steering wheel. Through the mirror, I watched the phantom flames bend and dance with each gust, behaving exactly as real fire would behave. Yet when I looked directly behind me, the highway remained stubbornly normal. Wet asphalt, scattered traffic, and the comforting weight of my trailer rolling steadily through the night. I tried adjusting the mirror, thinking perhaps water or road grime might be creating some kind of optical illusion, but no matter how I positioned it, the flames remained, growing brighter and more numerous with each passing mile. They seemed to follow me, staying always at the same distance in the reflection, neither gaining ground nor falling behind. Sometimes they appeared to be burning on the road itself. Other times they seemed to rise from the swampland that flanked the interstate, reaching up toward the stormy sky like the desperate fingers of some buried giant. By 3 a.m, as I approached the outskirts of Lafayette, the fire in the mirror had become a conflagration. The entire reflection blazed with orange and yellow light, painting the inside of my cab with dancing shadows that had no business being there. The heat seemed almost tangible now, though I knew it had to be my imagination. My air conditioning was running full blast, and the temperature gauge showed everything normal, yet sweat beaded on my forehead as I stared into that impossible mirror. That's when I saw the figure standing in the flames. At first, it was just a dark silhouette against the fire, barely visible through the dancing light and heat shimmer, but as I watched, transfixed despite myself, the shape became more distinct. A person standing motionless in the center of the conflagration, arms at their sides seemingly unaffected by the inferno that raged around them. The figure appeared to be watching me, though I couldn't make out facial features through the flames and the distortion of the mirror. My hands began to shake on the steering wheel. I forced myself to look away from the mirror, focusing instead on the highway ahead, on the familiar rhythm of driving that had been my life for 2 decades. Rain continued to streak the windshield, and the radio played an old country song about lonesome highways and distant homes. Everything was normal. Everything was as it should be, except for that damned mirror that refused to show me reality. But when I inevitably glanced back, the figure in the flames had moved closer. The person now stood at what appeared to be the front edge of the fire, still motionless but somehow more present, more threatening. I could see more details now. The figure appeared to be wearing some kind of uniform or work clothes, though the flames made it difficult to be certain. What disturbed me most was the sense that whoever it was had been waiting for me to look back, had known I wouldn't be able to resist the pull of that burning mirror. I reached for my CB radio with a trembling hand, finally ready to break protocol and ask for help. But before I could key the mic, the figure in the mirror raised one arm and pointed directly at me. The gesture was slow, deliberate, and unmistakably accusatory. As that finger extended toward me through the flames and across the impossible distance of the reflection, every light on my dashboard suddenly blazed to life. Warning indicators I'd never seen before glowed red and orange, joining the familiar constellation of gauges and switches. The temperature alarm chimed insistently, though the needle still showed normal operating range. My fuel gauge began to fluctuate wildly, the needle swinging from full to empty and back again in rapid succession. Even the CB radio erupted in static and voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize. their urgent tones cutting through the electronic chaos filling my cab. In the mirror, the flames roared higher, and the pointing figure began to walk forward, moving through the fire as if it were nothing more than morning mist. With each step, the electrical chaos in my truck intensified. The headlights flickered, the engine coughed and surged, and the air conditioning died completely, leaving me suddenly sweltering in the humid Louisiana air. I pressed harder on the accelerator, pushing my rig beyond safe speeds for the wet conditions, desperate to outrun whatever impossibility was pursuing me through that cursed mirror. The speedometer climbed past 70, past 80, the big diesel engine roaring its protest as I demanded everything it could give. Other drivers' voices crackled angrily over the CB, warning me about my reckless speed, but I couldn't slow down. In the mirror, the burning figure continued its relentless approach, now close enough that I could see what might have been a face within the flames. Dark hollows where eyes should be, a mouth open in what could have been a scream or a shout. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The electrical chaos ceased, leaving my dashboard dark except for the normal running lights. The CB radio returned to its typical late-night murmur of distant conversations. The air conditioning kicked back on with a grateful whoosh of cool air, and in the passenger mirror I saw only the wet highway behind me, empty of traffic and flames alike. I gradually reduced my speed back to legal limits, my heart still pounding as I tried to process what had happened. Perhaps it had been hallucinations brought on by fatigue and too much caffeine. Perhaps the electrical problems had somehow created the visual distortions in the mirror. I wanted to believe either explanation, needed to believe them, because the alternative was that something impossible had just tried to reach me through a reflection that showed things that weren't there. I made it to Jacksonville on schedule, delivered my load without incident, and tried to put the experience behind me. But every time I checked that passenger mirror now, I remember the flames and the figure that walked through them. The taste of thunder, from Marcus Rivera. The first drops hit my windshield just past midnight, somewhere between Bakersfield and nowhere, and I knew immediately that something was wrong with this rain. I'd been driving long haul for 17 years, seen storms roll across every stretch of highway from Maine to California, but I'd never tasted copper in the air before the clouds even opened up. My Kenworth's diesel engine hummed its familiar lullaby as I downshifted for the grade ahead, the headlights cutting through darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the light just yards beyond my bumper. The CB radio crackled with static, occasional voices drifting in and out like ghosts trying to speak through television snow. "Eastbound, you got your ears on?" someone asked, but when I keyed up to respond, only silence came back. The radio's green display flickered, casting eerie shadows across my dashboard, and I adjusted the volume, hoping to catch another driver's voice. Company was scarce enough on these lonely stretches, without losing contact with the few souls brave enough to run the night shift through California's Central Valley. That metallic taste grew stronger as the rain began in earnest, fat droplets exploding against my windshield with unusual force. I flicked on the wipers, their rhythmic sweep creating a hypnotic pattern against the glass, but something about the water bothered me. In the wash of my headlights, it looked darker than it should, leaving rusty streaks across the glass that my wipers couldn't quite clear. I leaned forward, squinting through the growing storm, and felt my stomach clench with an uneasiness I couldn't name. The highway stretched ahead like a black ribbon, empty except for my truck and the increasingly violent downpour. No other vehicles, no lights in the distance, just the endless asphalt disappearing into a wall of rain that seemed to absorb my high beams. I checked my GPS, but the screen showed only static, the satellite signal apparently lost in the storm. Mile markers had become invisible, and I realized I'd lost track of exactly where I was on Highway 99. The familiar landmarks were gone, swallowed by sheets of rain that hammered my cab with the persistence of angry fists. My CB suddenly burst to life with a voice so clear it made me jump. "Any drivers out there taste that copper?" The voice was gravelly, tired, like someone who'd been driving longer than sleep allowed. I grabbed the mic, relief flooding through me at the sound of another human voice. "This is eastbound Kenworth at mile marker." "Hell, I don't know where I am." "Yeah, I taste it too." "What you think it is?" Static answered me for long seconds before the voice came back, fainter now. "Ain't natural, driver. Been trucking 40 years, never tasted metal in the rain before tonight?" The copper flavor intensified, coating my tongue with a bitterness that made me reach for my coffee thermos. The liquid inside had gone cold hours ago, but I sipped it anyway, trying to wash away that unpleasant metallic tang. Outside, the rain continued its assault, and I noticed my wipers were leaving reddish streaks across the windshield. Not rust-colored anymore, but something deeper, darker, like old blood mixed with water, creating patterns that seemed almost deliberate in their design. I slowed the truck, downshifting as unease crept up my spine like cold fingers. The engine's rumble changed pitch, and for a moment I thought I heard something else underneath the familiar diesel growl, a sound like whispers or wind through metal. But when I strained to listen, it faded back into the rain's percussion against my cab. The heater was running, but I felt cold anyway, the kind of chill that starts in your bones and works outward. The voice on the CB came back, weaker now, breaking up with static. "Driver, you still out there? I'm seeing something up ahead, looks like." The transmission dissolved into electronic snow, leaving me alone again with only the rain and my engine for company. I tried to raise him again, keying the mic several times, but the radio had gone dead except for the occasional pop of atmospheric interference. That's when I saw the lights ahead, just barely visible through the curtain of rain. Not headlights or taillights, but something else, a soft pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the road itself, green and sickly like the luminescence of rotting wood. I eased off the accelerator, letting the Kenworth slow as I approached whatever was creating that unnatural illumination. The copper taste in my mouth had become so strong I could barely swallow, and I realized the air inside my cab was thick with that metallic flavor, as if the rain had somehow seeped through my sealed windows. As I drew closer, the source of the light became clear and my hands tightened on the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. The highway ahead was flooded, but not with ordinary water. The liquid stretched across the asphalt in a perfect line, as if someone had drawn a boundary across the road, and it glowed with that same sick green light. Steam rose from its surface despite the cool night air, and in that vapor I could see shapes moving, indistinct forms that might have been reflections, or might have been something much worse. I brought the truck to a complete stop about 50 yards from the glowing flood, engine idling while I tried to process what I was seeing. The rain continued to fall, but where it hit that phosphorescent water it seemed to disappear, absorbed instantly without creating ripples or splash patterns. The copper taste had become overwhelming now, so strong I had to fight not to gag, and I noticed my hands were trembling as they gripped the wheel. The CB crackled once more, that same gravelly voice cutting through the static with desperate urgency. "Don't touch the water, driver. Whatever you do, don't touch that glowing water." His transmission was barely audible through the interference, but the fear in his voice came through crystal clear. I touched it, and now I can't stop tasting the copper. It's in my blood, driver. It's changing me. I keyed up to respond, but before I could speak, I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Something was emerging from the glowing flood, rising slowly like a submarine surfacing in that luminescent liquid. At first it looked like debris, maybe a tree trunk or piece of machinery, but as it continued to rise, I realized it was shaped wrong, too angular and deliberate to be natural. The object broke the surface completely, revealing itself to be metallic, corroded and ancient-looking, covered in growths that pulsed with the same green light as the water. More shapes began emerging, scattered across the flooded stretch of highway like monuments in an underwater cemetery. They were all metal, all corroded, all wrong in ways that made my eyes water to look at them directly. Some were twisted into spirals, others formed geometric patterns that hurt to contemplate, but all of them dripped with that glowing liquid that fell upward instead of down. defying gravity as it returned to the flood from which they'd risen. The copper taste exploded across my palate with such intensity that I doubled over, retching into my coffee cup. When I looked up, wiping tears from my eyes, I saw that the metallic structures had moved closer to my truck, not walking or sliding, but simply occupying different positions than they had moments before, as if they existed partially outside normal space. The nearest one was now close enough that I could see details in its corroded surface, symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no language I'd ever seen, etched deep into metal that seemed to shift between different types as I watched. Steel became copper, became something that wasn't quite either. My engine began to sputter, the steady diesel rumble breaking up into irregular coughs and gasps. The dashboard lights flickered, and I realized the metallic rain was affecting my truck's electrical system. The headlights dimmed and brightened in random patterns, casting the approaching structures in stuttering illumination that made them appear to dance. I tried to shift into reverse, but the transmission wouldn't respond. The gear shifter moved freely in my hand, but nothing happened. I was trapped between the impassable flood ahead and some invisible force that prevented me from backing away. The CB burst to life one final time, that gravelly voice now distorted beyond recognition, barely human. "It's beautiful, driver. The copper taste? It's beautiful. You can taste the stars, taste the space between atoms. Come into the water, driver. Become part of the constellation." The transmission ended with a sound like metal tearing, and the radio went permanently silent. One of the structures had positioned itself directly in front of my truck now, its corroded surface reflecting my headlights in patterns that seemed to spell out words in that alien script. The copper taste was so overwhelming that I could feel it in my teeth, my bones, as if my entire body was slowly transforming into metal from the inside out. I could hear my heartbeat change, taking on a metallic rhythm that matched the pulsing of the glowing flood. The gravity well. From Marcus Chen. The first time I saw a rock floating above Highway 287, I assumed my eyes were playing tricks on me after 18 straight hours behind the wheel of my Peterbilt. The caffeine pills had stopped working somewhere around Amarillo, and that familiar cottonmouth sensation told me I was pushing my limits harder than usual. But when you're hauling medical supplies to Denver on an emergency contract, sleep becomes a luxury you can't afford. The steady thrum of my diesel engine had become a lullaby I couldn't surrender to, not with a deadline breathing down my neck like desert heat. The highway stretched ahead of me like a ribbon of black silk, illuminated only by my headlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness. This particular stretch of Texas highway had always felt different to me, more isolated than it should be for a major trucking route. The landscape rolled away on both sides in gentle hills dotted with scrub brush and the occasional oil derrick, their skeletal frames barely visible against the star-drunk sky. My CB radio had been silent for the past hour, which wasn't unusual for this time of night, but something about the silence felt heavier than normal, as if the air itself was holding its breath. That's when I noticed the first stone suspended about 10 feet off the asphalt, roughly the size of a basketball, hanging motionless in the air like some cosmic joke. My first instinct was to blink hard, rub my eyes, maybe reach for another coffee from the thermos wedged between my seats. Fatigue hallucinations weren't uncommon in my line of work, and I'd seen stranger things during marathon hauls across the country, but the rock remained there perfectly still, defying every law of physics I'd learned in high school. Its surface appeared weathered and ordinary, the kind of limestone common to this part of Texas, except for the minor detail that it was floating in midair like a forgotten balloon. I eased off the accelerator, my speedometer dropping from 75 to 60 as I approached the anomaly. The rock passed overhead with a soft whoosh that I felt more than heard, my trailer clearing it by several feet. In my side mirror, I watched it shrink into the distance, still hanging there like a monument to impossibility. My hands tightened on the steering wheel, the familiar texture of worn leather suddenly feeling foreign against my palms. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was suspended by invisible wires, some kind of art installation or college prank. But out here, miles from the nearest town, such explanations felt as unlikely as the floating rock itself. The next cluster appeared about 2 miles down the road, a collection of smaller stones hovering at various heights like a three-dimensional constellation. Some bobbed gently as if suspended in invisible water, while others remained perfectly stationary. They ranged from pebble-sized fragments to chunks as large as my fist, creating an aerial obstacle course that forced me to slow down even further. The sight was beautiful in its strangeness, almost mesmerizing, and I found myself leaning forward to get a better look through my windshield. The rocks caught my headlight beams and threw back subtle shadows, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance just beyond my peripheral vision. My CB radio crackled to life with a burst of static, causing me to jump in my seat. Breaker 19, anybody out there seeing what I'm seeing on 287? The voice belonged to another trucker, his tone carrying the same mixture of confusion and disbelief that I felt churning in my own chest. I grabbed the handset, grateful for the confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind completely. This is eastbound Pete, mile marker 142. You talking about the floating rocks? I kept my voice steady, professional, as if discussing weather conditions or road construction. Roger that. Pete, this is westbound Willie in a big red KW. Been driving for 32 years and never seen anything like this. They're getting thicker up ahead, just so you know. Some of them are moving now, kind of drifting around like they're alive or something. The word alive sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. I thanked Willie for the heads up and replaced the handset, but his warning proved accurate within the next mile. The floating stones were becoming more numerous and, more disturbingly, more active. They swayed and bobbed with increasing animation, some following lazy orbital patterns around invisible centers of gravity, while others pulsed up and down like breathing. The largest ones had grown substantially in size, some approaching the dimensions of small boulders that would definitely pose a threat if they decided to drop. The temperature gauge on my dashboard hadn't moved, but I felt sweat beating on my forehead as I navigated between the aerial obstacles. The rocks seemed to respond to my presence, shifting positions as I approached, creating narrow corridors for my truck to pass through. It was almost as if they were deliberately allowing passage, while simultaneously demonstrating their power to cut it off at any moment. The thought made my mouth go dry despite the coffee I'd been nursing for the past hour. My headlights illuminated what looked like a solid wall of floating stone ahead, rocks of various sizes packed together so densely that finding a path through seemed impossible. I downshifted and brought the truck to a crawl, my engine rumbling in low gear as I searched for an opening. The wall stretched across the entire width of the highway and extended upward beyond the reach of my headlight beams, creating a barrier that would have seemed impenetrable if not for the narrow gap that appeared near the center, just wide enough for a single truck to squeeze through. As I approached the opening, the rocks on either side began to pulse with a faint phosphorescent glow, as if lit from within by some unknown energy source. The light was subtle, barely visible, but it cast eerie shadows that danced across my windshield and gave the floating stones an organic quality that made my skin crawl. The air inside my cab felt charged like the moments before a lightning strike, and I noticed that the hair on my arms was standing on end. My radio began picking up strange interference, voices speaking in languages I didn't recognize mixed with what sounded like whale songs or the groaning of deep ocean currents. The passage through the wall took what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than a few minutes. The rocks pressed in close on both sides, some brushing against my mirrors and trailer with gentle scraping sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the supernatural quiet. I held my breath without realizing it, afraid that any disturbance might cause the carefully balanced formation to collapse and crush my truck like an aluminum can. The phosphorescent glow grew stronger as I progressed, bathing everything in an underwater light that made the familiar interior of my cab look alien and strange. When I finally emerged on the other side, the sudden return to normal highway felt like surfacing from deep water. The floating rocks continued for another mile or so, but they were fewer in number and less active, gradually diminishing until only scattered pebbles hovered at shoulder height. like glowing fireflies. My hands were shaking as I reached for my coffee, and I had to grip the thermos with both hands to avoid spilling it. The liquid was stone cold, though I could have sworn it had been steaming hot just minutes before. The sun was beginning to rise as I put the floating rocks behind me, painting the eastern sky in shades of amber and rose that should have been reassuring, but somehow felt ominous. In my rearview mirrors, the highway behind me looked perfectly normal. Just empty asphalt stretching toward the horizon with no sign of the impossible things I'd just witnessed. I grabbed my CB handset and tried to raise Westbound Willie, but got only static in response. Even my usual trucking channels were dead, as if the floating rocks had created some kind of communication dead zone that I was only now escaping. I made it to Denver on schedule and delivered my medical supplies without incident, but I couldn't shake the memory of those floating stones and their eerie phosphorescent glow. When I tried to research the phenomenon online, I found no reports of anything similar along Highway 287 or anywhere else. The official State Highway Department website showed no construction projects or detours in that area. No explanations for what I'd experienced during those surreal pre-dawn hours. 3 weeks later, I had another run that would take me back along the same route. I told myself I was curious, that I wanted to prove to myself that it had all been some kind of fatigue-induced hallucination. But as I approached mile marker 142 in the early morning darkness, my hands began to tremble on the steering wheel. The highway ahead looked perfectly normal, just empty blacktop disappearing into the night, but I swear I could see faint glowing specks in the distance, like stars that had fallen from the sky and forgotten how to land. My CB radio began to crackle with that same otherworldly interference, and somewhere in the static, I thought I heard Westbound Willie's voice calling out coordinates to a destination that doesn't exist on any map. The frequency of lost voices, from Marcus Big Mac. Henderson, the CB radio, started whistling on a Tuesday night somewhere between Flagstaff and Albuquerque, where the desert stretches endless under a ceiling of stars that seem too bright, too close, like they're pressing down on your cab with the weight of eternity. I'd been driving the same route for 15 years, hauling everything from appliances to auto parts in my Aero 4 Peterbilt, and I knew every truck stop, every hill, every place where the radio liked to pick up strange signals bouncing off the mountains. But this whistle was different, threading through the static like a silver wire pulled taut, rising and falling with a melody that seemed almost familiar, like something your grandmother might have hummed while stirring soup on a winter evening. At first, I figured it was interference from the radio towers scattered across the high desert, or maybe some kid with a modified radio playing games with the truckers. We get all kinds of nonsense on Channel 19, from conspiracy theorists rambling about government satellites, to lonely drivers talking to themselves just to hear a human voice echoing back through the darkness. The whistle would drift in for a few seconds, sweet and mournful, then fade beneath the usual chatter about speed traps and construction delays. I adjusted the squelch, fiddled with the antenna connection, but nothing seemed to make it go away completely. It lingered at the edges of every transmission like an auditory shadow, patient and persistent. The night was one of those perfect desert evenings where the air feels thin and clean, where your headlights seem to stretch for miles across the asphalt ribbon that disappears into the horizon. My rig was loaded with restaurant equipment bound for Phoenix, the trailer riding heavy and steady behind me, the engine purring with that deep, satisfied rumble that tells you everything's running just right. The CB crackled with the usual late-night traffic, drivers checking their positions, sharing coffee recommendations, complaining about dispatchers who couldn't read a map if their lives depended on it. Normal, comfortable noise that keeps you company when the miles stretch long and empty. But as the hours passed and the whistle grew stronger, clearer, more insistent, I began to notice that the other voices were changing, not all at once, but gradually. The way shadows lengthen at sunset until suddenly you realize the whole world has shifted into something darker. Drivers I'd been listening to for hours, familiar voices I'd heard on this route dozens of times, began incorporating brief whistled phrases into their transmissions, just little flourishes at first, A few notes tossed casually into a report about traffic conditions or a request for a radio check, but the whistling was always the same melody, that haunting tune that seemed to bypass your ears and settle directly into your bones. I keyed the mic to ask about it, but Big Joe out of Tucson cut me off with a weather report delivered in his usual gravelly drawl, except now he ended each sentence with a soft, lilting whistle that matched the phantom signal perfectly. Then Moondog, running eastbound with a load of furniture, chimed in with road conditions that degenerated into pure whistling by the time he reached the end of his transmission, the notes floating through the static like smoke rising from a campfire. One by one, the voices I'd been listening to all evening were being consumed by that strange, beautiful melody, their words dissolving into music that spoke of vast loneliness and roads that led nowhere. The mountains rose around me like sleeping giants, their peaks cutting jagged silhouettes against the star-drunk sky, and I realized I hadn't heard a normal transmission in over an hour. Every voice that came through my speaker was whistling now, sometimes starting with a few words about cargo or fuel stops before trailing off into those hypnotic notes. The melody was growing more complex, more layered, as if dozens of invisible musicians were adding their parts to an orchestra that existed only in the radio waves bouncing between the hills. My speedometer showed a steady 65. My fuel gauge registered half full. My thermostat ran cool and green, but the world outside my windshield was beginning to feel like a stage set built for a play I didn't understand. Then I heard my own voice coming through the speaker, clear as if it were a recording, reporting my position at mile marker 247 and asking about construction delays near the New Mexico border, but I hadn't touched the microphone. It hung in its clip beside my left elbow, exactly where I'd left it 20 minutes earlier, and my own transmission was ending with that same whistled melody, my voice carrying the tune with the confidence of someone who'd been whistling it all his life. The hair on the back of my neck rose like prairie grass in a storm wind, and I reached for the CB's power button, suddenly desperate to cut the connection to whatever frequency of madness I'd stumbled into. But my hand stopped halfway to the radio, frozen by a sound that made my blood run cold and my foot ease unconsciously off the accelerator. Through the static and the omnipresent whistling, I heard my father's voice, rough with the cigarettes that had killed him 5 years earlier, reporting his position on a highway that didn't exist anymore, hauling a load of steel to a factory that had been demolished before I was born. The transmission was clear and strong, as if he were driving parallel to me on some phantom interstate. And he ended his report with the same whistled melody before switching to a longer, more complex piece that I suddenly recognized as Danny Boy, the song he used to whistle while working on engines in our garage when I was 7 years old. The desert around me remained unchanged, sagebrush and sand stretching to every horizon, but the darkness between my headlight beams seemed deeper now, pregnant with possibilities that had no business existing in a rational world. My CB continued its impossible chorus, voices from the past and present blending into a symphony of truckers who might have been driving these roads for decades, their transmission somehow preserved in the thin air and electromagnetic fields that danced between the mountains. Like aurora made of memory and longing, I heard drivers I'd known who died in accidents, retirement parties, heart attacks at truck stops, all of them checking in with dispatchers who existed only as echoes in the static. The exit for Gallup appeared in my headlights like a beacon, and I downshifted carefully, my air brakes sighing as I began the long curve down from the interstate, toward the truck stop that glowed like a jewel against the desert floor. Behind me, the CB whistled its endless song, but the closer I got to the lights and activity of the real world, the fainter it became. By the time I'd backed into a parking space between a Kenworth hauling grain and a freightliner loaded with produce, the voices had faded to whispers, then static, then silence. I sat in my cab for a long time, engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the normal sounds of a truck stop at midnight. Diesel engines idling, air brakes hissing, the distant murmur of conversations from drivers grabbing showers or coffee before pushing on toward morning. My CB radio sat quiet and innocent on its mounting bracket, displaying channel 19 on its digital readout, just like it had for the past 3 years. When I finally worked up the courage to key the microphone and call for a radio check, the responses came back normal and profane, full of complaints about load schedulers and DOT inspections, blessed ordinary grievances that had nothing to do with phantom melodies or voices from beyond the grave. But now, whenever I'm running that stretch of highway between Flagstaff and Albuquerque in the deep hours of the night, when the stars hang low enough to touch and the desert spreads silent in every direction, I keep my CB radio turned low and try not to listen too carefully to the static between stations. Because sometimes, just at the edge of hearing, I can still catch fragments of that whistled song, patient and eternal, waiting for another lonely driver to tune in and join the chorus of voices that travel roads existing somewhere between memory and the endless night. And sometimes, God help me, I catch myself whistling along. The crawling dashboard. From Marcus, the highways between Phoenix and Albuquerque stretch like ribbons of black velvet under the desert stars, and I've driven them more times than I can count in my 30 years behind the wheel. My Kenworth T680 hums with that familiar diesel purr that's become as comforting as a lullaby. The dashboard lights casting their soft amber glow across the cab as the miles roll beneath my 18 wheels. The radio crackles with late-night trucker chatter, voices drifting in and out like ghosts on the airwaves, but tonight I keep the volume low, preferring the steady rhythm of the road and the whisper of wind against the sleeper cab. It's past 2 in the morning when I first notice something's different about the air conditioning. The vents are pushing cool air as they should, but there's a faint earthy smell mixed in, like soil after rain or maybe mulch from a garden center. I've hauled plenty of agricultural loads over the years, and sometimes those scents linger in the trailer. But I'm running empty tonight, deadheading back to my home terminal in New Mexico. The smell isn't unpleasant, just unexpected, and I crack the driver's side window slightly to let some of the desert air circulate through the cab. The night is crystalline clear, the kind of darkness you only find in the Southwest, where the sky opens up like a vast cathedral, and the stars shine so bright they seem close enough to pluck. My headlights carve through the blackness ahead, illuminating the painted lines and reflector posts that mark the shoulder, and somewhere in the distance I can see the faint glow of another truck's taillights, red dots disappearing over a rise in the highway. The CB radio whispers with static and the occasional burst of conversation from drivers still pushing through the night. Their voice is a comforting reminder that I'm not alone out here in this endless expanse of sagebrush and stone. The earthen smell grows stronger as the miles pass, and I notice my dashboard seems to be collecting more dust than usual. The soft blue glow from the GPS screen shows a thin layer of what looks like fine dirt settling over the gauges and controls, though I cleaned the cab thoroughly just yesterday at the truck stop in Phoenix. I reach for the microfiber cloth I keep tucked beside my seat and wipe across the speedometer face, but the dust seems to return almost immediately, as if it's being continuously fed through the ventilation system. That's when I see the first one, a small dark shape moving near the base of the windshield where the dashboard meets the glass. At first glance, I assume it's just a shadow cast by the passing landscape, but then it moves with deliberate purpose, scuttling from behind the radio display toward the air conditioning controls. My hands tighten on the steering wheel as I lean forward slightly, trying to get a better look without taking my eyes off the highway for more than a second at a time. The shape is definitely alive, about the size of a quarter, with what appears to be multiple legs moving in that distinctly arthropod manner that makes my skin crawl even when I encounter such creatures in normal circumstances. It disappears beneath the climate control panel, and I tell myself it's probably just a spider that somehow found its way into the cab. Nothing more unusual than the occasional hitchhiker that finds its way into trucks parked at rest stops or loading docks. But then I notice more movement, subtle at first, but growing more obvious as my eyes adjust and focus on the dashboard surface. There are more of them. Small dark insects emerging from what seem to be impossible spaces between the perfectly fitted panels and displays. They move with purpose but without haste, like they belong here. Like this is their domain and I'm the intruder. Some appear to be ants, their segmented bodies catching the amber light from the gauges, while others are harder to identify in the dim illumination. Their forms too small and quick to examine closely while maintaining control of 40 tons of rolling steel. The earthen smell intensifies, and I realize it's not coming from the air conditioning at all, but from the dashboard itself, as if the plastic and metal surfaces have somehow been infused with the scent of rich, dark soil. The dust I noticed earlier isn't dust at all, I now understand, but rather a fine layer of earth that seems to be seeping from microscopic cracks and joints throughout the dashboard assembly. As I watch in growing unease, tiny granules of dirt trickle from behind the gauge cluster, creating small piles that the insects navigate around as they go about their mysterious business. I consider pulling over, but the nearest exit is still 15 miles ahead according to my GPS, and something about stopping on this empty stretch of highway in the middle of the desert feels wrong, feels dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with the creatures colonizing my dashboard. Instead, I maintain my speed and try to focus on the road, though my peripheral vision keeps catching movement as more insects emerge from what should be solid surfaces. A larger shape catches my attention near the passenger side of the dashboard, and when I risk a longer glance I see what appears to be a beetle nearly 2 inches long, its carapace gleaming like polished obsidian in the gauge lights. It moves deliberately toward the center console, antenna twitching as if testing the air, and I notice that the earth smell has grown stronger, now carrying undertones of decay and something else, something organic and alive that reminds me of the forest floor. After autumn leaves have fallen and begun their slow transformation back to soil, the insects don't seem aggressive or even particularly interested in me, but their presence transforms the familiar comfort of my cab into something alien and unsettling. They emerge in increasing numbers from impossibly small spaces, as if the dashboard itself is hollow and filled with tunnels and chambers where they've built their colony. Some carry tiny particles of debris in their mandibles, while others seem to be trailing fine threads of web or silk that catch the light like gossamer strands. My CB radio crackles to life, but instead of the usual trucker chatter, all I hear is a soft scratching sound, like tiny claws or legs moving across the speaker mesh. I reach for the volume knob to turn it down, but as my fingers approach the control, I see that it's surrounded by a cluster of small black ants that scatter at my movement, disappearing into crevices that shouldn't exist in the solid plastic housing. The highway ahead curves gently to the right, following the natural contours of the desert landscape, and my headlights sweep across the familiar terrain of rocky outcroppings and sparse vegetation. But something's changed about the view through my windshield, a subtle distortion that takes me a moment to identify. The glass itself seems to be developing a pattern of hairline cracks, but as I look more closely I realize they're not cracks at all, but rather tunnels or burrows visible just beneath the surface, as if insects are somehow living within the supposedly solid windshield itself. The realization hits me that this isn't just an infestation, but something far more disturbing, a transformation of my truck itself into something that serves as habitat for these creatures. The dashboard continues to discharge its steady stream of fine earth, and the insects move through their tunnels and across the surfaces with the confidence of long-established residents. Some of the larger specimens have begun to venture toward the edges of the dashboard, approaching the seat and steering column, and I feel a deep primitive revulsion at the thought of them reaching me. I press harder on the accelerator, eager to reach the next truck stop where I can escape this rolling terrarium. But the speedometer needle doesn't respond to my input. Looking more closely at the gauge, I see that its face is obscured by a thick layer of soil, and behind the glass something moves with deliberate purpose, as if insects have colonized the very mechanism of the instrument. One by one, my gauges and displays begin to dim and fail as their internal workings become clogged with earth and occupied by creatures that shouldn't be able to exist in such environments. The exit sign finally appears in my headlights, promising fuel and food and blessed escape from this nightmare cab. But as I move to engage the turn signal, I discover that the lever is surrounded by a writhing mass of what appear to be centipedes, their segmented bodies twisting around the chrome handle like living decoration. I force myself to grab the lever despite my revulsion, feeling the creatures scatter under my touch, their feet tickling across my skin like whispered threats. The truck responds to my steering input, and I guide it down the off-ramp toward the bright lights of the travel plaza. But as I begin to apply the brakes, I realize that the pedal feels different, spongy and unreliable. And when I look down, I see that the floor around my feet is carpeted with insects, their bodies creating a living mat that shifts and writhes with each movement of my boots. The brake pedal sinks toward the floor as if the hydraulic lines have been compromised, and I pump it frantically while downshifting to slow the massive truck. Somehow I manage to coast into the parking area, the truck finally rolling to a stop near the fuel islands where the harsh fluorescent lights flood the cab with harsh white illumination.